Thank you for tuning in. Join me today for the repair and restoration of my Pioneer SX-1980. If you enjoy vintage audio equipment, you've come to the right spot. Please subscribe and hit that notification bell, as well as giving me a big thumbs up if you like this video, and share it with others. There is a risk of serious injury or death from electrical shock working on this equipment. If you're not comfortable with working on the equipment, please do not take the cover off and consult a professional. I just want to give you a little background on the Pioneer SX-1980. It was produced from 1978 to 1980 and output an incredible 270 watts per channel into 8 ohms at 0.03% distortion. This was right at the height of the receiver wars, and this is the most powerful receiver that Pioneer ever produced, and one of the most powerful that anyone ever produced. This video shows the repair and restoration of a Pioneer SX-1980. This one's in very good cosmetic condition, but after 40 years, it's in need of some repairs and restoration. I've begun to disassemble the SX-1980. You know, it comes apart fairly easily at this point. You know, of course you take the covers off, top and bottom, and then I've already removed the faceplate. You've got to remove the knobs. No difficulties there. It's pretty standard as far as a vintage receiver to get it apart to this point anyway. It's a little bit dusty in there, but boy, have I seen worse. It's really not too bad, and this should be a fairly easy cleanup. The Pioneer SX-1980 is a very reliable receiver. Where people do have issues is the power supply. You know, they've got a reputation for running very hot. After 40 years, most of them need some sort of a restoration and a component replacement. Sits at the bottom of the receiver, and the heat just stays there. It has no way to really get out of the chassis, so it just runs very warm. You can see in some of these pictures very dark spots, and this is where the transistors from the pictures above were removed with their heat sinks. And you can see that it gets warm there, and that's been for 40 years. So on this board, I'll replace all of the transistors on the power supply, just because they've been through a rough life for 40 years, and it's pretty amazing they made it, this long with the heat generated. I will also change out all of the electrolytic capacitors on this assembly. You know, once again, they've had a hard life. I'll use mostly Nishinikon PW series capacitors, which are high temperature capacitors, and hopefully it'll go another 40 years. I also used deoxit to clean up the pots, the switches, the various contacts in the unit. I also use, like this receiver is pretty good size, it's pretty heavy, there's a lot to it, and what I do is I'll use tie wraps to kind of give me a third hand. Like in this picture, I show a tie wrap at the top. It's just kind of hanging there, and it gives me that third hand to do two things. One, to access the components easier, but also not to twist the wires back and forth excessively. I mean, this is all point-to-point wiring. I mean, there's no modular connectors, and this is just the way they did it in the late 70s, both commercial and like this consumer equipment. They used a wire wrap gun at the factory, and they took those wires and they spun them onto the pins, and that's fine and dandy until they get 40 years old and you start bending them around. So I went through all the various assemblies in the SX-1980, changing all the electrolytics or bipolar capacitors that were in it. Also changing some of the transistors that are just known to be noisy. And after 40 years, again, it wouldn't be a surprise. And many of these transistors are 2 and 3 cents a piece. While you're in there, you can put a modern equivalent in and have peace of mind that you probably won't have to get back into this for some time. At least hopefully you won't. As I said, this is a time-consuming project. You're not going to get it done in one evening. There's a lot to take apart. Just take it one step at a time, and you can probably get through it. The push-button switches are very problematic in this unit. Not just this unit, but any of them that have them. They're very difficult to get at, to clean, unless you remove the assembly itself. In this case, this unit has a pretty good amount of slack in the cables. So if you do remove something, you can usually work with it somewhat, and that's what I've done. To clean these switches better, I've removed each assembly and then just laid it out in some manner to where I can get at everything easier. The big thing too is it's going to take you time to get this apart, and if you get it back together and you've got some kind of intermittent problem with some of these switches or the controls, you're going to hate to tear it back apart again. And tell me how I know it's a good idea to make sure you clean these well while you do have it apart. You know, the push button switches really are a leading cause of the intermittent issues. Now, if you got a channel totally out, or you've got some other problem, you know, blowing fuses, this isn't your problem. But, you know, sound coming and going, you know, it's kind of low on one channel and you screw around with the buttons and starts working. It's probably these guys here. I use a piece of cardboard, you know, when I've got these assemblies out. Deoxit's a wonderful product, the spray, and it gets almost anywhere you want it to get, but it also gets in places you probably don't want it to get. And so, you know, I'll just squeeze some cardboard in there, and so when I spray it, most of it stays where I want it to stay, and it's not all over the chassis somewhere, because it'll certainly attract dirt over time. So you just want to, you know, use the spray the way you should use it, and that just requires you to put something around it, you know, to catch the spray, and I use a little bit of cardboard. And these push button switches, you can tell many times if you've gotten it into the switch well. There's little holes on the top. You can kind of see them there in the middle of these 3 switches. And when you spray at the front where this spring is, where you see the blue plastic and then the white one, the blue. You spray right up in there, and if you get it up in the switch correctly, that spray will come right out of those holes. So you kind of know, hey, I got it. I got it where I was supposed to get it. And now here's a time-consuming thing too. Once you've done that, don't push them 2 or 3 times and think you're done. Push them 30, 40, 50 times. I know it seems ridiculous, but once again, you want to make sure that you've got these clean. So you've taken all this time to take it apart, you get it back together, and now one of your push button switches is intermittent. You're going, oh no, because, you know, it's going to take some work to get back in there. So take the extra time, push those switches more times than you want to, and it'll pay off at the end. You can get these boards in a position, you know, where you can work on them. There's enough slack in those cables, and by using tie wraps and getting them into a position that you need, you can work on them and get to them. And again, you want to bend these things a minimum amount of times. Think any wire. This wire is no different than any other wire. Bend it back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and, you know, eventually something's going to break. So try to leave them in a position where you don't have to do that often. And there's a very good chance you'll get through all this and not break any wires. If you do break a wire, that's all right too. Most of us don't have wire wrap guns, and what you do if you break a wire, you're probably going to need to solder it back on the pin. You know, put a few twists on there, hit it with a little solder, and you'll be good to go. I used modern test equipment to gain match transistors that are needed to be gained. Not every transistor needs to be gain matched, but some of them in the signal path need to be gain matched. So that's just you know, kind of what it says. So when you're using the volume control, one side doesn't sound louder than the other. I mean, there's a few spots where that's important, and so I use an Atlas DCA Pro to match the gain of those transistors. There's some places I use filmed capacitors where there were low value electrolytics. Again, you got to do a little bit of research before you begin a project, and you know, many of these have been done, and so you can find out what other people have done and what they shouldn't have done. You know, as I said, there's some of these assemblies don't have many components, but they're still 40 years old. A couple of capacitors and a transistor to change here and there. I did it on all the different assemblies, even if they didn't have a whole lot of components on them. Started to reinstall everything back in. I've got the top, when I say top, the ones nearest the radio dial back in, and then the ones that are down below, the couple assemblies, then I'll put them in right under it. They just go right back up in there and you screw them in. You know, now it's probably a good time, you've done quite a bit of work here, to just give it a shot and make sure everything's okay, and I did that. I noticed I had an issue with the FM, and so I took a look at that. Really, I should have said this before, but I'll say it now. You should have the service manual for this unit, and this service manual is available from the internet. HiFiEngine.com, which is a great resource for vintage audio manuals and schematics. They have it, and you really should download that first before you start this. I should be mentioning that. Also, if you're going to, you know, in my case, I had an FM issue. So if you're going to mess around the FM section, you really need to have the proper equipment, and I'll repeat it for the 5th time, the service manual that'll tell you what to move, when to move it, and where to look at the signals and what you should have. But I use an ST-1000A FM alignment generator, and that was pretty much state-of-the-art back in the day. So still does a great job. It's vintage itself, and it does a great job with the FM section of vintage audio equipment. Once I aligned the FM section, I could then tune and lock into stations, you know, much better. You know, before I did the alignment, you know, the signal strength would show maximum strength, but the tuning, the center tuning knob would be off, the fine tune lead would not locked to quartz locked, and you know, there's just little, it worked, but it wasn't quite right. And after 40 years, some of these components drift. It really didn't take much to get it back working. So I moved on from there, and I'm gonna replace the filter capacitors. Are they still good? I think they are. I've got some equipment that can test filter capacitors, but they're 40 years old. You know, I'm doing all this work. Why not change them out? The 4 filter capacitors, I believe they were about $25 each. And mentioning those, probably there was another $100 in capacitors and transistors in this project. So you probably got a couple $100 for the material, you know, and then if you can do it yourself, great. If you've got to have someone else do it for you, it's going to cost you some money, because it's a lot of time. It just takes a lot of time to do this. You know, as I said, you're not going to get it done overnight, but if you're going to do it, you might as well do it right and not be in there and change out one thing and then have to come back in a year and do something else, or in 5. So as I said, decided to change out the filter capacitors. No big deal getting them in or out. You know, they're still available, fortunately. You know, not from Pioneer, but the filter capacitors that will fit in here, the correct diameters and everything, are still available. So I don't know how much longer they'll be available, but right now they are. So I went ahead and started to replace those. Of course, clean the chassis up and everything, you know, while you pull them out, and started to install them. and hopefully the new ones will go 40 years too. So I've gotten the 4 installed. Gonna hook them up. Got them in the chassis, and then I just got to hook them up here at the bottom. So I just put it up on the bench and, you know, did some basic, just use the controls, played with it a little bit. Then I set the idle current and the DC offset. Again, the service manual has the procedure for that. Get the service manual. You're not going to be able to know how to do this if you don't. You know, there wasn't no issues there. The DC offset was just about 0, and was able to set the idle current just about to spec. You always want to do that, you know, after you've rebuilt a unit, and before you take it to bench testing. And that's another thing. You know, you see so many people, you know, they recap these things, but they have no equipment to test it. You know, there's nothing wrong with recapping, believe me. I think anything 40 years old needs to have the electrolytic capacitors changed out, and sometimes other things, you know, just because they have a history of failing. But when you're done with all this, you know, you really need to have a bench test. And I use a signal generator. I also use some vintage test equipment. Again, some sound technology vintage test equipment that was used on many, many test benches back in the day. I use an ST3200 audio analyzer, which is, again, a piece of vintage test equipment from the 80s, but it does a great job. And your ears are wonderful. This test equipment will validate what you've done, and you'll feel good that that not only your ears say you've done good, but the test equipment does too. So, you know, you can run it through various frequencies and through various wattages. In this one's case, it did very good. You know, the volume control really, all through its range, stayed 1 to 2% between the channels. So, you know, here I'm showing 84.1 watts continuous out of the left and 84.8. That's good. You know, would you like it perfect? Maybe. But that certainly is well within spec, and that's something you're not gonna hear. So I also calibrated the power meters. All the specs are there for you to test. As I said, you can test most of these if you want to with the proper test equipment. So I'm just about done here. What I'll do, I'll just leave it up here on the test bench and just let it run, and just make sure, give it a little bit of burn-in time, and if all is well, we'll wrap it up. So I replaced about 135 capacitors and transistors during this restoration. You know, always use respected names. They're just a few pennies more. You know, if you're doing all this, you know, you could buy the El Cheapos, you know, and save a few pennies each, and at the end a few dollars each, but it's crazy. It doesn't matter any particular brand, but, you know, any of the big brands, where in this unit's case, I used a lot of Nishinikon, you know, capacitors, a great company. But if you use Panasonic, or, you know, there's tons of other ones that are reputable, and I don't know that one capacitor is better than the other, but I'll tell you that a brand new capacitor is better than a 40-year-old one, whatever it is. So just buy good stuff. One final check, and I'm going to be all done with it. I'm going to go through and, you know, play with the FM and play with the controls, and just make sure before I move it off here, you know, she's ready to go. And there goes the heard the speaker relay, so that's always a good sign. So I think she's probably come to life here. If you enjoyed this video, I'd appreciate a big thumbs up down below. If you're not presently a subscriber and you enjoyed this video and like to see more, please subscribe. And for my present subscribers, as always, thank you so much. Y'all have a good day.